After the first day of middle school, Jordan arrived home with a new toy, a school-issued iPad. Of course, it wasn't given as a toy, it was given as an educational tool. But to your average 12-year-old who's never owned a smartphone or an Apple product, well, it was pretty cool. Now, Jordan's dad, a guy named John, was pretty curious about what Jordan could access on the device. So he took it into his room. He knew that the district had promised to filter explicit content, but he also knew that it was his parental responsibility to ensure that his son wasn't traipsing around with the pornography portal. Within 3 minutes, John accessed porn. He was shaken, but he assumed the best. Jordan's iPad must be malfunctioning. So John took the iPad back to school and he had the filter reinstalled. But the filter still didn't block porn. For at least the last year, the school's filter hadn't been able to block significant amounts of illicit content, and the district knew it. But they chose not to inform parents. Instead, they dealt with it on a case-by-case basis. The taxpayer-funded district was happy to allow children to stumble onto porn until their parents found out. Or I should say, if their parents found out. This is not a fictional story. I changed a few identifying details, but it's also not an uncommon story. It can happen in your city. It probably has already happened in your city. So if you haven't thoroughly tested your child's school-approved device, drop this YouTube video and go do so immediately. As a pastor, as a parent, and a tax-paying citizen, I want Christians to recognize what's happening in school classrooms. I also want you to have credible secular research to share with school administrators to show them why we need these devices out of our schools. You need to do this for the sake of your children and your neighbor's children. This is an act of courageous truth-telling, and it may well be one of the most important acts of love our generation will undertake. Let me tell you the whole story. Starting in the mid-2010s, big tech companies like Apple and Google began to distribute their devices cheaply to schools. They were doing this to get children hooked on their products at a young age, kind of like tobacco companies of yore. And they knew that if they did this, they could collect all of this data on the children and in the future sell them ads and of course sell them products. Now, I want to be gracious to schools. It is hard for perennially underfunded schools to resist free money and free products. Add to that the fact that the average American has unwavering faith in technological progress. When you put those things together, it's a wicked cocktail. Perhaps that explains why our educational landscape underwent an unprecedented technological revolution in a single decade, with almost no research or analysis. I've experienced this as a board member of my daughter's Christian school. We were offered tens of thousands of dollars from big tech in grants to pay for one-to-one devices in our classrooms. Saying no to that offer felt like stealing something from students. It felt like resisting progress. But we said no anyway, because our pressing question wasn't how can we restructure our curriculum around new technology, but instead, what technologies are best suited to serve our educational mission. Technology wasn't our master, it was the servant, and there wasn't enough research to prove that it was a good servant at all. Most districts are taking a very different tack. They've doubled down on a dangerous bet. Techno-optimism. They think it'll pay off. They've created entire departments to manage classroom technology and keep technology in classrooms. These are district-level decision makers whose careers require the existence of one-to-one devices. And that puts concerned parents and wary teachers at a disadvantage because, as Upton Sinclair once wrote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. If research shows their technology harms students, and I'll get more to that later, if that's what research shows, the question is, will district-level administrators turn back the techno tide, even if it means they lose their jobs? I'm not very optimistic. Parents will have to apply pressure, and Christians should lead the way with gentleness. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, actually shows a causal link between social media, school-provided technology, and smartphone adoption, and the rapidly rising rates of teenage loneliness, social disorders, anxiety, depression, and body dysmorphia. But teenagers, they don't really need Jonathan Haidt's book to see the problem. A recent Pew study found that 44% of teenagers believe it's harder to be a teen today than 20 years ago. Their number one explanation? Technology. They're saying technology is making their lives harder. Ironically, lots of parents disagree. They think it's easier to be a teenager. But those who claim that it's easier to be a teenager today, they actually said that it's easier because of technology. Our children know that they need less technology, but the adults inside schools don't see it. In fact, they think it's making their lives easier. And maybe that's why they're requiring them to use screens more. Jessica Gross, who's a writer for the New York Times, put it this way: There's little or no evidence that screen-based educational products actually work. That simple fact should be enough to make us question why schools deploy tremendous resources toward devices and device management. As an Associated Press analysis of public education documents concluded, quote, many of the largest school systems spent tens of millions of dollars in pandemic money on software and services from tech companies, including licenses for apps, games, and tutoring websites. Schools, however, have little or no evidence that these programs helped students. Recent research reported in the MIT Technology Review suggested that in-class devices aren't merely neutral, they're actually holding students back. This may be because children learn significantly more using pens and paper than they do on screens. New research suggests that national reading comprehension has dropped by 4 points amongst 13-year-olds, not because of COVID-19, but because of screens. Other researchers found that when students read text on paper, deeper learning was easier. When they read on screens, quote, shallow reading was observed. All of this fits with a broader trend in educational research. Technology is useful when training students in rote, constrained skills like multiplication tables and phonetics. And it's almost completely useless when developing complex, unconstrained skills, which is to say, all the important ones. This is even true of the most popular education apps, which researchers at Penn State, Harvard, and Boston College and the University of Crete have all described as, quote, low quality. Unfortunately, many media personnel in schools will trot out the very few positive studies about tech in classrooms and use those as justification for their policies. This is misleading because most studies argue that the good technology does is very limited, and they show a negative correlation between learning and technology. So it's important to gently push back and share some meta-analysis that give a fuller picture. Another thing to consider is that technology is just incredibly distracting. It can be distracting in part because these devices are often used for bullying. That's a social distraction. But one problem is even far more innocent than bullying. Screens themselves are just distracting. A recent Program for International Student Assessment study found that 2/3 of American students report being distracted by digital devices in their mathematics lessons, and 54% report being distracted by other people's devices. Educators see this firsthand. They see how scattered the attention of their students is. And this is why many of them are the ones sounding the alarms. Even students are admitting to parents that they're watching YouTube in school instead of paying attention to class. According to the New York Times, students and parents are crying out for help. But these cries often fall on deaf ears. I've heard of technology officials inside of districts who basically say that YouTube is necessary for a student's educational journey and that's why they won't get rid of it. The truth is the opposite. One study on educational uses of YouTube found that only the most educationally motivated students actually benefited from the platform. And for most students, any and all smart devices in the classroom hampered their educational journey. One Rutgers researcher found that students lose, quote, anywhere between a half and a whole letter grade if they are allowed to consult their phones in class. There's a reason many elite private schools are removing technology from their classrooms. Because it's better for learning and they need successful students. But in lower income schools, devices, which are freely given by these big tech companies, well, they become a form of classroom management, and they seem to be increasing the educational divide between the wealthy and the poor. The negative effect of screens are also more pronounced in children from broken families. Likewise, they're more pronounced amongst those who are diagnosed with ADHD. And despite increased diagnoses of ADHD, few people are discussing how school-provided screens not only exacerbate ADHD's worst challenges, but may even worsen or cause the symptoms. If Jesus' mission was to, quote, set the oppressed free, we too can care about oppression in the large and small places where we find it, including the effects of technology on the poor and on the needy. One last piece of evidence to consider. School filters that are supposed to keep pornography off your kids' devices, they often break. Despite your school's best efforts, updates break filters. And kids are smart. When Apple or Google updates their device, the filters will fail. And kids know this, even if their parents don't. And even when the filters are functioning properly, there are always easy workarounds to get around them. In fact, the internet is chock full of guides for students wanting to jailbreak their devices. Even if your child chooses not to break the rules, her quote-unquote filtered device will still show her YouTube ads and banner ads that are littered with softcore pornography and highly suggestive material. Now, of course, it's a parent's responsibility to talk to his or her child about pornography and to disciple them. But part of a parent's discipleship must entail limiting device access until a child is prepared to handle the temptation. The schools aren't giving parents choices. Instead, these tech administrators are telling parents to deal with the problem that the schools created at home. This not only ignores the fact that parents can't monitor their children at school, and lots of children are accessing pornography at school, but it also minimizes pornography's tremendous damage if a child stumbles upon it. It's not a small deal. Research shows that pornography is, quote, connected to negative developmental outcomes, including a greater acceptance of sexual harassment, sexual activity at an early age, acceptance of negative attitudes to women, unrealistic expectations, skewed attitudes of gender roles, greater levels of body dissatisfaction, rape myths, responsibility for sexual assault to a female victim, and sexual aggression. The simple truth is that once a school gives children devices with access to pornography, they've given them a destructive drug. There's good news. The tide is turning. This summer, the U.S. General called for social media to carry a warning label. Jonathan Haidt's book has helped to elevate the problem into popular consciousness, but it's not enough. Institutions must be reformed, and reformation almost always requires both external pressure, in this case from parents, and internal pressure, in this case from educators and administrators. I've seen this locally. Since the advent of one-to-one devices in our community, there has been a quiet, respectful, but bold group of Christian parents, educators, and administrators resisting district-level adoption of technology. They've made slow, halting progress over the years, and they've discovered that as they add more voices, their influence is increasing. District officials can no longer ignore their concerns. The Spirit has uniquely equipped and empowered us believers to combat unjust systems with love, mercy, kindness, and grace. Precisely the character required to make lasting institutional change. So this is not the time for cowardice. It's time for Christian parents to push back against educational excesses, to fight for higher digital security, and to seek to reduce screen use in class. If possible, they should push schools to follow UNESCO's advice and ban smartphones. If that's not possible, they should argue for screen limits in high school and the removal of one-to-one devices in middle school and elementary schools. And that's because those are the ages at which these devices are by far the most harmful. What we can't do is sit by passively. We can't sit here and hope that kindness without speech will win the cause. The truth is that most districts want to educate and care for children. They want to do what's right. But financial pressure from tech companies is heavy, and internal incentives to preserve jobs inside the district for media professionals, well, that's also quite strong. What districts need are parents, teachers, and principals willing to present the evidence in a way that respects the dignity of all involved parties. Together, we must heed Jeremiah's command to seek the welfare of the city where God has sent us, by following research and encouraging schools to stay focused on their core educational mission, not digital distractions.